Chapter 2. La Festa. For the next few weeks, Coppola prepared for the party. He began to write poetry once more. "How does this sound, Astu?" he asked. "The sad bird sings only for the hope that he will remain again, for the winter comes once more. That poor bird, alone in the tree, cannot find his love." Astu was shocked. "That's quite wonderful, Sir Coppola." That was not the sole poetry that Coppola wrote. Within his notes, there was one poem he did not ever read to anyone. "My soul burns for the day when I'm free. My thirst for the torment and destruction of those beasts is beyond measure. Feed, hunt, kill, annihilate. That is all I wish. Bring to me my own body a new life to claim." Often his poetry was unorthodox, but this was above that in terms of derangement. At last, he began his journey to the party, which was at Emilio's estate in Trapani. It was only about half a day's travel. However, it did go through several mountains. As he traveled, he looked and marveled at the beautiful ocean and the sun that slowly surfaced down the horizon, and by the time they had reached Trapani, it was near dusk. Even while they traveled across rough terrain, he began to write to himself, "What must one man do to find true purpose in a world full of animals?" Suddenly, the coach hit a rocky surface, and it shook the carriage. The horses whinnied, but they regained their control over the terrain. "What a nuisance," Coppola thought. "Can't this road be smoother? First you curse the road built by man, now you curse the road built by nature," he responded. "Can't you find solace in anything?" "Apparently not," he replied. "Are we near Trapani?" asked the coachman. "I'd suppose we are near." "Signor," the coachman yelled, "I'd thought I'd let you know that I can see the city over the mountains." The city was like Palermo. The buildings and architecture were nearly identical. However, there were definitely more mountains and cliffs than what Coppola was familiar with. "Why can't we be free?" Coppola asked. "Live here as a commoner and sail the sea forever?" Again with the questions, he replied to himself. "Why can't you be content with what you have? You are rich, you never have to lift a finger, and yet you choose to. What good is living in luxury if I am given no sense of freedom? Even in luxury, it is still a prison. What punishment is given to you? What torture befalls upon you? None. You pity yourself with mindless fashions of self-doubt and destruction." "Enough of this," Coppola finally superseded. "I will not have this discussion. Not here. Not now." When they came to the city, it was late afternoon, early dusk. The city of Trapani bustled with excitement and energy. As in Coppola's home of Palermo, there were markets selling their wares, horses and carriages clopping through the old and beaten stone road, and shops that sold shoes, watches, and other important goods. Coppola, as with all sorts of noises, was especially displeased. Coppola looked through the satin curtains and watched the commoners dressed in plain clothing selling all sorts of items. He was especially interested in how large the tomatoes were, as they were a much larger size than he was used to in his hometown. As he watched through the window, a plain woman looked up at the coach, and they made contact. Coppola became rather embarrassed at this sight, and shifted away from the window for a time, before quickly moving back to see the road. Eventually, they were no longer in the markets, but in more domicile areas. Coppola understood this well, and knew they were quite close to the home of Barone Alessandro Emilio. Coppola was wearing his finest clothing, just as Marco had selected for him. The blue and yellow complemented him very well, but just in case of accidents, Marco was certain to bring an extra set of clothing for Coppola. After all, it is proper to be prepared, especially for a formal party such as this. At last, The coach arrived at Emilio's fantastical manor. It was slightly smaller than the palazzo. However, it was still a spectacular sight. At the front gate, two great eagles perched on the pillars, as if to give watch to any who dare approach. The black gates opened, and Coppola could see the great fountain that surrounded the courtyard. He saw multiple carriages, guests on their way to enter. The coachman brought himself around the fountain and to the entrance. The doors of the manor were open wide as guests dressed in gallant clothing stepped inside. In front of Coppola was a carriage painted a deep green. The black horses whinnied and a man stepped out. He appeared rather old, and the only thing that covered his face was a gray beard, which was properly groomed. He too was dressed in green with golden embroiderment. He bowed to the mistress, and he walked inside with his white-gloved hand inside his coat. After this, the mistress opened the door, and Coppola stepped out. Like the man before him, he bowed softly and stepped up the stairs into the mansion. As he entered, a rush of sweet music filled his ears. Violins were serenading, and people were talking quite loudly. However, they were walking to the left into a grand ballroom. On the ceiling, graciously lit chandeliers glistened, and the music grew louder into his ears. To his right, a large table, which held cakes, wine, cheese, and crackers. Coppola had not eaten much the entire day, and was rather famished. He strode to the table and began to eat some cheese. It was a rich pecorino, which Coppola did not like. It tasted too sour. "Che schifoso," Coppola said distastefully. However, he swallowed it, as he did not wish to make any scene. Instead, he ate a piece of fresh provolone. What a wonderful taste! He poured himself a glass of wine. As he was about to drink it, in front of him was the host, Baroni Emilio. "Benvenuto, Signor Coppola," he exclaimed out to the acoustic ballroom. "I see you are enjoying our delightful snacks. If there is any other food you wish, just say the word and—" "No, thank you. This does me well," Coppola calmly explained. "Thank you for inviting me. It is my pleasure. Anything for the son of Baroni Coppola. That reminds me," he said before he quickly shuffled to the other side of the ballroom, where a group of 4 or 5 men were standing. He walked back over. With one of the men, it was the man in the green and gold. "Young Coppola, I present to you Count Orlok, the Count of Hamburg himself," said Baroni Emilio excitedly. The Count looked flattered. "Pleasure to meet you. You must excuse my accent. Italian is not my native tongue," he explained. "You speak very well," Coppola replied as they shook hands, his white glove encompassing Coppola's hand. "This is Francisco Coppola, son of Edoardo Coppola," Emilio elaborated. "I invited him to this party." The Count's eyes widened as he looked at Coppola's face. "Truly?" Count Orlok blurted with surprise. "Why, it is. It looks just like him. Your father and I were good friends. A long time ago, you see." "Is that so?" Coppola responded. "What caused your distance between him?" The Count stood for a second, his wrinkled forehead flexed. "Yes. Well, we have our own personal matters. Being Count of Hamburg is no easy position," he added. "Dealing with the local people, I'm sure your father would understand the intricacies." "That also reminds me," shouted Emilio. "The dance is about to begin. Are almost all of our guests accounted for?" Emilio asked one of the concierges. "I believe so," he replied. "Excellent. Then we shall dance in due time." Emilio dashed away. "It was good talking to you, Francisco." Count Orlok smiled. "I hope to see you in the future. Perhaps you can be as good of a scholar as your father." He walked away, back to the men he was speaking to before. Coppola drank his wine finally and noticed the full scale of the ballroom, the chandeliers, the open windows, the shining floor, and the sweet music. It only created a sense of peace within Coppola's mind before he was so rudely interrupted. "Excuse me, sir." A pompous woman in a bright gown said, with a thick accent, "Would you like to dance with me?" "This woman is vile," he thought. "I don't want to dance with her. What choice do we have? Shall we act improperly for declining a woman's request to dance?" "Yes, I shall dance with you," he reluctantly answered. The woman's grin engorged. Thus, the dance began. Although Coppola was not accustomed to parties, he knew how to dance. As they danced, Coppola asked a question. "Where are you from, miss?" "Oh, I'm from Bohemia," she shouted and guffawed. "Yes, that explains it." They danced in a square step. As they danced, Coppola scanned the room to see where Count Orlok was. Emilio was flaunting, as usual, dancing with some pansy woman, but the Count had vanished. With suspicion, Coppola excused himself. "Wait!" the woman cried out. "You haven't even tipped me over!" Coppola shifted away from the ballroom into the outer courtyard. He breathed a sigh of fresh air, but didn't exhale completely. He heard a sound, unrecognizable, but strange. He sneakily went around in the courtyard. There were fountains, beds of flowers, and leaf statues of cupids and angels. Finally, underneath some stairs, Coppola found the origin of the sound. It was coming from a door that led to the cellar. It was not unnatural to have people bring up wine from the cellar, but once again, Coppola felt something wasn't right. He carefully opened the doors and walked down into the cellar, down stone steps where light barely touched. Even the door from the outside would do him no good. It was nearing evening, and the light was fading. Of course, there was wine in the cellar, and even some beer. However, it was not beer or wine Coppola sought. From upstairs, he heard cheering, questioning what he heard before. Suddenly his mind raced. "What do you think it is?" It sounded terrifying. "I can't truly describe the sound." "We should leave." "What?" "Nothing's going to be that serious. It was probably a wine bottle or something that dropped." "Which is why we should leave." He heard the sound again, and this time it was more clear. It was a cry of pain. But from where? All Coppola could see were racks of wine. There wasn't anything in here but a faint light. A faint light? Coppola thought. From where? He peered to where the light was and saw through a small hole between the stone walls and the wine rack, torchlight, and a secret hall. That must be where they get the expensive wine. Maybe someone is injured in there. Coppola then pushed lightly on the wine rack, and it began to swivel. When Coppola reached the other side of the hall, he heard the sound once more. It was most certainly a cry for help. Coppola was not rash. He slowly sneaked down the hall, and to his left. It was a woman, one of the women from the party, a daughter of a duke or baron perhaps. She lay in a basin filled with a pool of blood, naked and chained to the wall. Surrounding the room were 5 to 10 men. Suddenly, one of the men walked up to her and turned around. He was dressed in a dark red robe with a strange cross symbol on it, which was identical to the one above the basin of blood. "Today, brothers of the faith," he began to speak in Latin, "we inaugurate one of our own, in this very special year, to the rank of brood." They chanted something foreign, and he continued. "Come forward, Count Klaus Orlok," he announced, and the Count walked forward to him. The man kissed Orlok on the cheek, and then announced, "Our day comes soon, and we shall all witness the true glory of our leader and master, the zealous one. Amen." "Amen!" all the men shouted out. The girl began to cry out for help again. Coppola continued to peer around. "Take unto the dagger of silver, the dagger Triaconta, and sacrifice this virgin in his name, that you may be given the blessing, not of death nor of life, the gift of perpetuation. Amen. Amen, they once again shouted. Coppola looked away, and all he heard was a deafening scream, a shriek that shook even his most corrupted points to the bone. When he looked back, a dark aura fixated around Count Orlok, and he began to raise his arms up and bare his teeth, for they were sharp and pointed like knives. He appeared much younger than before, as all of his wrinkles were suddenly gone. The woman lay, sliced by the blade, and into the basin, and the symbol above her sprayed with blood. Her thick dark hair had been stained with blood, and pieces of it fell into the basin. The people cheered and chanted something foreign once again. Coppola, when he saw what Count Orlok was, lost his senses. His breathing grew quick with intensity. His eyes widened and darkened, and without resistance yelled, "Down with you, spawn of hell!" A moment of quiet and pause, cheering from the room above them. "He has seen too much!" shouted one. Abrupt chaos, the whole began to charge at him in a triumphant scream. Coppola, as they approached, shouted a triumphant cry and began to laugh, inhaling sporadically. They stopped. "He's gone quite mad." "Who is this?" a man responded. "He's lost all capability." Still, he continued to laugh, covering his face. Then he stared at them, his eyes poking between his fingers, and when they looked into his eyes, they were darkened. "You bastards killed her," he shouted aloud. "Now all of you will suffer." The man in the black and dark red robe came up to his face, but Coppola did not feel his breath. "And what?" he replied. "Are you going to do about it?" Coppola quickly grabbed a torch from the wall and threw it at them, setting his robes ablaze. He shrieked, and as he did, Coppola dashed down the hall, turning the wall behind him. The priest quickly tossed his clothes aside, revealing his thick, long black beard. "It's time we leave," he commanded. "Orlok, as part of your initiation, kill the boy." "It will be done," the Count grinned. As Coppola ran back up the stairs, he heard a loud bang as Count Orlok, without any effort or pain, cleared the entire wall, leaving rubble in his path. "Young Coppola," the Count said mockingly in a sing-song tone, "come back, we have more to discuss." The cellar doors slammed shut. Coppola, in his fear, tried to run to his carriage. He brushed through the garden and over the small black gate surrounding it. Then, the doors of the cellar burst open, leaving white pitch tinder in its path. The hunter was now the hunted. As he got to his carriage, suddenly from the top of the roof of the manor jumped down the Count, right in front of him. Coppola could clearly see he was younger and taller than before. His deep green attire was stained with dried blood, soaking into it. Coppola stopped in fear. As the Count towered over him, he began to sniff Coppola. "Your hands, they are stained," he remarked. "You've been busy, young Coppola." He kicked the carriage and it tipped over effortlessly. The horses fell and then escaped from their reins, neighing away. Coppola had nowhere to go. He backstepped to the carriage. His face became a distasteful look. He dared call Coppola young. "Tell me," Orlok asked, "how many have you killed? 5? 10? Coppola finally spoke up. As he was next to the carriage, his suitcase had fallen out onto the ground. 16, Coppola replied. "It will be 17 now." He quickly grabbed his pistol in his suitcase and fired a bullet at Count Orlok, who continued to walk to him, slowly, bullet after bullet. He simply could not hit the Count. Inside the ballroom, a few people heard the gunshots. Emilio, not knowing of what occurred outside, ordered the musicians to continue playing and began to dance with bravado. "Never fought a brood before?" Orlok cracked a devilish smile. "I understand. No mere mortal could take down the utter power of a vampire with true intent." He grabbed Coppola by the neck and he began to gasp for air. He wheezed, for the grip of the Count was strong. "You honestly thought all vampires were simple prey?" Orlok laughed, his set of fangs shining in the moonlight. "Have you any last words, son of Coppola?" The Count regarded as he loosed his hand slightly to let him speak. "How did you know my father?" He dwindled out. "Your father," the Count said. But before he could respond, he felt a sharp pain, then a burning sensation, as a knife had entered his upper chest. He was the one who now began to wheeze, and Coppola was set free, relinquished from his grasp. From his suitcase, Coppola had concealed a knife, brandished silver, and now it had entered the chest of Count Orlok. The Count fell to the ground on his back, his hand still held up. He shuffled back and began to reach to pull out the knife, but before he could, Coppola put a few more silver bullets into his flintlock. "Any last words, Count Orlok?" He whispered softly. "Your father and I," the Count weakly pitted out. Before Coppola realized, the knife he had placed in the chest of Count Orlok was in his shoulder. He began to feel the pain and screamed, reaching for the knife. Then the Count pushed him and brought him against the undercarriage. Blood slowly poured out of the Count's chest. "I'm not going to kill you just yet," he told Coppola. "I want to play with my food before I feast." He reared his teeth in anticipation and laughed raspily. He slowly pulled out the knife inside Coppola's shoulder, making sure he felt every inch of it. "Now, here is what I wish of you," Count Orlok said. "You will run as far away as you can, and I will hunt you down." The Count let go of Coppola, and he began to run, not to the manor, the road, nor the woods, but into the steep cliffs that surround the backyard of the manor, where winding paths ensue. Down the paths, surrounded by white rock and moss, he ran. However, he had an upper hand, for he was still holding his loaded pistol, and when the time was right, he would use it effectively. Even though he is agile, he thought, the Count is still very vulnerable. As he was dashing down the hill, he noticed a rather large boulder on the hill's corner. "Then let's kill that bastard once and for all." The Count waited, and finally he began to hunt. He jumped down each steeping path, creating a loud boom each time. He began shouting out for Coppola. Coppola hid behind a patch of trees, waiting for his perfect moment. The Count began to jump down the mountain, sniffing the air. Finally he stopped. As his mouth opened, he sighed and shivered with excitement, for he saw blood on the ground from Coppola's wound. The Count's stab wound had almost healed. "You know, your father and I," he continued, "we both studied at the University of Vienna together. He was a wonderful student and a good friend of mine. Unfortunately, he took the one I loved, your mother." Coppola froze, and suddenly his mind raced. His breathing intensified. "She was a lovely woman, dear Maria. I'm very sorry that she died," he commented. "Although I wish I was there to show your father's complete incompetence." Coppola jumped out from behind the trees and shouted with a great roar, "How dare you speak of her that way?" "Found you," the Count said as he rushed towards him rapidly. But just as he was going to strike, a large boulder struck into him, dropping and rolling onto him. Coppola, with a prideful stride, walked up to his body. "You should have been more careful about jumping down. This cliff is quite dangerous." He sneered and mocked the Count. "You," Orlok groaned, as his bones were crushed by the large boulder on top of him, with only his upper body remaining. "Let me live, please." "What was that?" Coppola leaned with his ear cupped. "I couldn't quite hear you." "Let me live," he cried. "I'll do anything. I'll let you become one of us. The world will soon be ours." "Oh, you're offering an arrangement?" Coppola turned around, as if to think on it, but instantly turned around and pointed his flintlock at Orlok's head. "Made up my mind. No thanks." "Please, I don't want to die," Count Orlok cried out. Tears began to run onto his face. Coppola leans down and says to him, See, there's a thing I don't like about you vampires. I'd never become one of you, because all you can think about is staying alive. I'd rather wish you stayed dead, please. The Count, flabbergasted, began to grow in rage. Coppola! Shouted the Count. Cursed be you and your family on the final day in November. A bullet went into his skull. Then another. Shut up! Then Coppola stifled back to the domicilio, his arm clutching his gaping wound. He entered the ballroom. Once they noticed him and his wound, the music stopped, and multiple gasps were heard echoing about the ballroom. Coppola's hair was a mess, and he was covering his stab wound with his hand. The Count, he whispered, attacked me. He fell to the ground, his flintlock sliding away as he lost his grip on it. Blood was on the ballroom floor, and a few ladies, including the one with Emilio, fainted at the sight. The woman Coppola danced with also fainted, and the man with her did his best to hold her up. Conversation was abruptly paused, and shouting began. Help him! He's injured! Emilio shouted out to his servants. Immediately, the servants brought him to a guest bed and did what they could to suppress the bleeding. After they took him, Emilio yelled, Silence! The room grew to a complete hush following his command. Everyone must go home now. The event is canceled for obvious reasons. When Coppola awoke the next morning, next to him was a servant girl, nursing him to health. He was no longer wearing his clothing, and he had bandages over his shoulder. Drink, she commanded. You don't have any strength. She made him drink the water. Baruni Emilio and his maiden entered. Young Coppola, how is your health? He asked. I see you are awake. The girl, did you find her? Coppola asked him. Yes, one of my servants last night, when putting away the wine. His maiden began to cry. He put his hand on her shoulder. Our daughter. He also began to cry. Coppola became enraged. His maiden cried out, Oh, my Lucia, and ran in tears. I should have known she had run off, Emilio sorrowfully said. But I didn't want to control. You'll be happy to know her murder is avenged, Coppola proudly said. Count Orlok did this? Emilio yelled. I'll tear him limb from... He's at the bottom of the cliff, Coppola said back to him. This is terrible, he shouted back in fear. A count was killed on my premises. The authorities will be here. Tell no one what I did, Baruni Emilio, Coppola solemnly responded. For my sake and your daughter's. I promise, the Baruni replied. Is there anything I can do for you? Coppola sat up. His wound had been patched, but he still winced with pain as he walked to the door where Emilio was. My carriage was tipped over. I'll need new horses. Yes, your coachman is still here. Your father also knows of your injury. I also need one more thing, Coppola requested. Yes, anything. It wasn't just the Count that killed your daughter, he explained. There's a religion dedicated to sacrifice. I need you to help me. Help me destroy them once and for all. That explains the cross. Baruni Emilio was amazed. Anything you desire, I'll provide it. First, I'll need some silver.